The train's whistle pierced the October morning as it approached what the conductor called Millfield Station. Though Clara Bell Harrison could see nothing resembling a proper town through the dusty window, her 10-year-old daughter Alice pressed her face against the glass while 5-year-old Samuel slept against Clara's shoulder, his small hand clutching the wooden horse she'd carved for him during the long journey from Missouri. Clara smoothed her worn blue dress and checked the letter in her pocket one more time. Pastor John Matthews' careful script promising a home, a school to teach, and a fresh start for them all. The weight of her life savings, $37, sewn into her corset felt both precious and terrifyingly insufficient as the train began to slow. The platform was nothing more than weathered planks beside rusted rails, and as Clara stepped down with her children and single trunk, she felt the first cold fingers of doubt creep into her chest. Alice wrinkled her nose at the smell of sage and alkali dust, while Samuel woke with a whimper. Confused by the harsh sunlight and empty landscape stretching endlessly toward purple mountains, the conductor handed down their belongings with barely concealed pity, muttering something about folks who don't know when to quit, before the train pulled away with a final, mournful whistle. Clara stood holding her children's hands, surrounded by silence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums, and wondered if she'd made the greatest mistake of her life. The walk into town revealed the true scope of her situation: boarded windows, sagging roofs, and tumbleweeds caught against abandoned storefronts like nature's own funeral wreaths. Alice counted aloud the empty buildings they passed. Mercantile, closed. Saloon, closed. Bank, closed. Mama, why is everything closed? Clara's throat tightened as she forced brightness into her voice, explaining that Pastor Matthews would meet them at the church, that surely people were just ... resting. Samuel's stomach growled audibly, and Clara realized with growing panic that she hadn't seen a single person, heard a single sound of life, since leaving the train. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street, and somewhere in the distance, a loose shutter banged rhythmically against a building like a broken clock counting down to nothing. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. At the church steps, Clara found a hastily written note tacked to the door. Miss Harrison gone to Denver for opportunity. Town finished. Sorry, J. Matthews. The words hit her like a physical blow, and she sank onto the wooden steps while Alice read over her shoulder, her young voice stumbling over the cruel brevity. Samuel began to cry, sensing his mother's distress, and Clara pulled both children close, her mind reeling with the impossibility of her situation: no husband, no job, no home, and barely enough money for train fare back to a life that had already rejected them. The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing down the empty street, and Clara closed her eyes against both the grit and the tears threatening to fall. She had burned every bridge to get here, sold everything they owned, and now sat in the ruins of a dead dream with 2 hungry children depending on her next decision. Well now, that's a sorry sight if I ever seen one. The gravelly voice belonged to an old man, emerging from what appeared to be the only maintained building on the street, a small house, with a crooked chimney sending up a thin line of smoke. Pete McConnell moved slowly but purposefully, his weathered face creased with something that might have been sympathy as he took in Clara and her children. You must be the school teacher Matthews wrote about. Figured you'd show up eventually, though I told him it was fool's business bringing anyone to this godforsaken place. His words were harsh, but his pale blue eyes were kind as he looked at Samuel's tear-streaked face and Alice's protective stance beside her mother. Clara straightened her shoulders and stood, brushing dust from her skirt with hands that only trembled slightly. Pete explained the town's death with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who'd watched dreams die before the mine played out. Families scattered like leaves, and Matthews fleeing just last week when the church board's final payment never came. Only reason I stayed is I got nowhere else to go, and somebody's got to keep the coyotes from taking over completely, he said, studying Clara's face with shrewd eyes. You got return passage. When Clara shook her head, unable to voice the words aloud, Pete's expression softened further. Well then, I reckon you better come see what we're dealing with. House next to mine has a decent roof, and there's a well that still runs clear. Won't be comfortable, but it's shelter. As he turned toward his home, Clara felt the first stirring of something stronger than despair, not hope exactly, but the fierce maternal determination that had carried her this far. The house Pete offered was indeed basic: one room with a stone fireplace, a table with uneven legs, and a bed frame that would barely hold Alice and Samuel together. Clara stood in the doorway, calculating space and possibilities while the children explored with the resilience of youth. Alice already planning where her few books would go, and Samuel discovering a family of field mice in the corner. Pete watched Clara's assessment with interest, noting how she tested the stove's chimney draw and examined the window frames for drafts. Most folks would have taken one look and headed for the next train, he observed, but you're figuring how to make it work, ain't you? Clara turned to meet his gaze, and for the first time since reading Matthew's note, she felt a spark of her old teaching confidence returning to her voice. That evening, as Clara tucked her children into their shared bed with blankets Pete had grudgingly provided, Alice asked the question that had been haunting them all. "Mama, are we going to stay in this empty place?" Clara sat on the edge of the bed, looking out at the ghost town's main street bathed in moonlight, and felt the weight of decision settle on her shoulders like a mantle. She could use their remaining money to flee back to Missouri, back to the charity of distant relatives who'd made clear their disapproval of her unmarried motherhood, back to the shame and limitation that had driven her west in the first place. Or she could choose to plant roots in this unlikely soil, to bet everything on the wild possibility that what appeared dead might simply be sleeping. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet steel that her students had always recognized as unshakable resolve. "We're going to stay, sweetheart. This town needs us, and we need a place where we can build something of our own." Clara's words surprised even her with their certainty, but as she spoke them, she felt the rightness settling in her bones. Alice's eyes widened with excitement, the prospect of adventure outweighing fear in the way of children, while Samuel simply nodded sleepily and asked if they could have pancakes for breakfast. Clara smoothed his hair and promised they would indeed have pancakes, though she had no idea how she would make that happen with their dwindling supplies. The moon painted silver squares on the floor through the single window, and Clara sat listening to her children's breathing slow into sleep while her mind began to work, teacher practical and mother fierce, on the problem of survival. Pete knocked on their door before dawn, carrying a coffee pot and wearing the expression of a man who'd wrestled with his conscience all night. "Been thinking about your situation," he said without preamble, pouring coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe into Clara's offered cup. "There's maybe 8 families scattered within 20 miles of here, homesteaders mostly, trying to scratch out farms. Their children ride 15 miles to the county school, when weather permits." He paused, studying Clara's face in the lamplight. Now, if there was a closer school, with a proper teacher, might be some families would pay for the convenience. Clara felt her heart begin to race as she understood his meaning, not charity, but opportunity disguised as pragmatism. By full daylight, Clara had walked every building on Main Street with Pete, taking inventory of possibilities, while Alice and Samuel played explorer in the abandoned structures. The old schoolhouse had a sound roof and intact windows, its blackboard still bearing the ghost of some long-ago lesson in arithmetic. The general store could be converted to living quarters if needed, and the church, despite Matthew's abandonment, remained structurally sound with an intact bell that still rang when Alice pulled the rope. "Building's not the problem," Pete observed, watching Clara run her hands along the schoolhouse desks with the reverence of a woman greeting old friends. "Problems convincing folks to trust their children's education to a stranger in a ghost town." Clara turned from the blackboard where she'd unconsciously begun sketching a lesson plan, her eyes bright with the first real excitement she'd felt in months. "Then we won't be strangers anymore," Clara declared, her teacher's mind already organizing the challenge into manageable steps. "I'll visit every homestead within riding distance, introduce myself and the children, show them what we're offering. Education is something parents will sacrifice for, especially when it's closer than the county school." Pete raised an eyebrow at her sudden transformation from desperate refugee to determined pioneer, but Clara was already deep in planning mode, calculating distances, supplies needed, and the delicate diplomacy required to convince scattered families that the dead town of Millfield held their children's future. The morning sun streamed through the schoolhouse windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like possibilities in the golden air, and Clara felt the first stirring of the vision that would either save them all or lead to magnificent failure. The first family Clara approached was the Andersons, whose weathered homestead lay 7 miles east through rolling hills dotted with sage and struggling wheat. Martha Anderson opened her door to find a composed young woman in a clean but mended dress, flanked by 2 well-behaved children and old Pete McConnell looking uncomfortable on horseback. Clara introduced herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning over skeptical parents, explaining her credentials and her vision for a proper school in Millfield with patient thoroughness. Martha's 4 children peered curiously from behind her skirts, while her husband Jacob listened from the doorway, his expressions cycling through surprise, interest, and careful doubt as Clara outlined her proposal with the practiced clarity of a born educator. "You want to teach our children in a ghost town?" Jacob's question carried reasonable skepticism, but Clara was ready with practical answers: smaller class sizes, individual attention, and most importantly, no dangerous winter rides to the distant county school. Martha Anderson's interest sharpened visibly at this last point, remembering too many anxious mornings watching her children disappear into blizzards for the sake of their education. Young Emma Anderson, age 8 and clearly the family scholar, stepped forward boldly to ask Clara about books and arithmetic, receiving answers that demonstrated both knowledge and genuine affection for teaching. By the time Pete and Clara prepared to leave, the Andersons had agreed to visit Millfield the following week to see the proposed school, and Martha had quietly pressed a jar of preserved peaches into Clara's hands with the understanding that passed between mothers. The second homestead proved more challenging. The Kowalski family, Polish immigrants whose English was limited but whose desire for their children's education burned fierce and bright. Clara found herself communicating through gestures, drawings, in the dirt, and Alice's surprising gift for mimicking sounds, until meaning became clear. Little Stanislaw Kowalski, age 6, demonstrated his eagerness to learn by showing Clara the letters he'd scratched into a piece of bark, while his older sister Anna shyly revealed a collection of wildflowers she'd pressed and labeled with phonetic spellings. Clara's heart swelled with recognition of their hunger for knowledge, and she spent the afternoon teaching Anna proper English names for her specimens, while Stanislaw practiced writing letters in the dust with a stick. His concentration absolute and beautiful. By week's end, Clara had visited 6 homesteads and received commitments from 4 families, 16 children ranging from 5 to 14 years old, enough to justify opening a school and generating modest income. The Hendersons, whose twin boys had been struggling with the long ride to county school, were particularly enthusiastic, offering to help repair the schoolhouse in exchange for reduced tuition. Clara spent evenings by lamplight creating lesson plans that would accommodate the age range and skill levels she'd encountered, her teacher's instincts fully awakened after months of dormancy. Alice and Samuel had become her unofficial ambassadors, their easy way with the other children helping to bridge the gap between stranger and teacher. And Clara felt the first solid foundation stones of their new life clicking into place. The schoolhouse renovation became a community effort that brought the first signs of life back to Millfield's empty streets. Jacob Anderson proved skilled with carpentry, repairing desks and installing new shelving for books, while the Henderson boys' father revealed a talent for making the ancient stove burn efficiently without filling the room with smoke. Clara threw herself into the physical work with surprising enthusiasm, wielding paintbrush and hammer with the same intensity she'd once applied to lesson planning, and finding deep satisfaction in the transformation of space from abandoned to welcoming. Pete watched the activity with gruff approval, occasionally offering tools or advice, but mostly just enjoying the sound of voices and laughter returning to buildings that had stood silent too long. On the day before school was to officially open, Clara stood in the cleaned and organized classroom, feeling a complex mixture of pride, terror, and profound gratitude for the families who had chosen to trust her vision. The afternoon light streamed through clean windows onto freshly scrubbed floors, illuminating 17 small desks arranged in neat rows and a blackboard that bore her carefully written welcome message in 3 languages: English, Polish, and German for the Muller children who would start the following week. Alice arranged wildflowers in mason jars while Samuel proudly demonstrated his newly learned skill of ringing the school bell, and Clara felt the stirring of something deeper than professional satisfaction, the recognition that she had not just found a job, but discovered her calling to nurture growth in unlikely places. The first month of school revealed both the challenges and rewards of Clara's ambitious undertaking, as children arrived each morning from scattered homesteads carrying lunch pails and eager faces, transforming the quiet town into a bustling hub of learning and laughter. Clara discovered that teaching a one-room school with such age diversity required every skill she'd ever developed, along with several new ones, as she orchestrated lessons that challenged the older students while nurturing the youngest beginners. Young Emma Anderson proved to have a gift for mathematics that allowed her to help tutor the struggling Kowalski boy, while the Henderson twins' natural leadership abilities made them perfect assistants for organizing materials and maintaining order. The rhythm of school days brought structure not just to the children's lives, but to the entire community that was slowly coalescing around this single, vital institution. Clara's success with the school attracted attention beyond the immediate farming families, including a visit from County Superintendent Williams, who arrived unannounced one October morning to evaluate her unconventional educational experiment. Clara watched nervously as he observed her lessons, noting the mixed ages, the improvised materials, and the obvious affection between teacher and students. But his stern expression gradually softened as he witnessed the quality of learning taking place. Emma Anderson's recitation of poetry impressed him visibly, while Stanislaw Kowalski's careful English sentences demonstrated Clara's skill with language instruction, and the older students' collaborative work on a geography project showed both academic rigor and practical cooperation. When Superintendent Williams finally spoke to Clara privately, his words carried surprising approval mixed with cautious official recognition. "Miss Harrison, I'll be honest, came here expecting to find an inadequate situation that would require intervention," Williams admitted, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed his notes from the morning's observation. "Instead, I've found what may be the most innovative and effective rural education I've encountered in my 15 years in this position. Your students are not just learning, they're thriving." Clara felt her heart leap with relief and validation, but Williams continued with more serious implications. "However, the state requires certain standards for official recognition, including proper certification and facility improvements. I can give you provisional status for this year, but you'll need to make changes to continue." The weight of bureaucratic requirements settled on Clara's shoulders, but she met his gaze with the steady determination that had brought her this far. The news of provisional status spread quickly through the farming community, triggering both concern about the school's future and a surprising groundswell of support for Clara's efforts. Martha Anderson organized a meeting at the schoolhouse where parents gathered to discuss how to help Clara meet the state requirements, their investment in her success now deeply personal and practical. Jacob Anderson volunteered to lead a building committee to expand the schoolhouse, while the Hendersons offered to contribute lumber from their own property, and even the shy Kowalskis presented a carefully saved collection of coins to help with certification costs. Clara sat at her desk listening to these generous offers with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by the transformation from isolated stranger to valued community leader in just a few short months. Winter's approach brought new challenges that tested both Clara's resilience and the community's commitment to their educational experiment. As November storms made the roads nearly impassable and forced several families to board their children in town during the worst weather, Clara found herself not just teacher, but surrogate mother to children whose families trusted her completely with their most precious possessions. And she rose to the challenge by creating a warm, structured environment that felt more like a large family than an institution. Pete surprised everyone by revealing hidden domestic skills, helping Clara cook hearty meals for the temporary residents, and telling evening stories that kept the children entertained. During long winter nights, the shared adversity bonded teacher, children, and community even more strongly, creating ties that would prove crucial in the trials ahead. December brought an unexpected visitor to Millfield in the form of Charles Whitman, a well-dressed businessman from Denver who arrived in a fancy carriage and immediately began asking pointed questions about property ownership and development potential. Clara watched with growing unease as he measured buildings, examined water sources, and took notes with the systematic thoroughness of someone planning significant changes. His polite inquiries barely concealing hungry interest in the land values. When Whitman approached her directly about the school's lease arrangements, Clara felt the first chill of genuine threat to everything they'd built, recognizing in his calculating gaze the kind of ambition that viewed their small community as merely an obstacle to greater profit. Pete, observing the stranger's activities with the sharp eye of experience, pulled Clara aside with warnings that carried the weight of hard-learned wisdom. "That man's got development fever," Pete warned, his weathered hands gesturing toward Whitman's carriage disappearing down the main street. "I've seen his kind before. They come in with big money and bigger plans, buying up everything they can get cheap and pushing out anyone who doesn't fit their vision." Clara felt her stomach tighten as she realized the implications, understanding that their fragile community could be swept away by forces completely beyond their control. All their careful progress rendered meaningless by the simple power of wealth and legal ownership. The children were preparing for their Christmas program, their excited voices drifting from the schoolhouse, and Clara experienced a fierce, protective surge that surprised her with its intensity. These families had trusted her vision, and she would not let their faith be betrayed by circumstances or predators. The winter wind whistled through the empty buildings around them, but Clara heard in it not desolation but a call to defend what they'd built together. Christmas week brought both celebration and crisis, as the children's holiday program drew families from across the county, filling the schoolhouse with proud parents and curious visitors who witnessed firsthand the remarkable transformation Clara had achieved in just a few months. Emma Anderson's flawless recitation of Longfellow brought tears to her mother's eyes, while the Kowalski children's English caroling demonstrated the school's success with immigrant integration, and the collaborative nature scenes painted by students of all ages showed the cooperative spirit that had become Millfield's signature. The applause was warm and sustained. But Clara noticed Charles Whitman in the back of the room, taking notes with the focused attention of someone gathering intelligence rather than enjoying childhood performance, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with December weather. After the program, Whitman approached Clara with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. His proposition delivered with businesslike directness that barely concealed underlying threat. "Miss Harrison, I represent investors interested in developing this area for mining and timber operations. Your little school is charming, but it stands in the way of progress that could bring real prosperity to the region." He offered to relocate her school to a better location with modern facilities, but Clara heard in his words the destruction of everything they'd built, the scattering of families, the loss of community, the reduction of their human achievement to mere inconvenience. Her response was polite but unmistakably firm, causing Whitman's practiced smile to slip slightly as he realized he was dealing with someone who could not be easily bought or intimidated. The confrontation with Whitman galvanized the farming families in ways Clara hadn't expected, as word of the development threat spread through the community like wildfire and triggered a defensive response that surprised everyone with its intensity. Jacob Anderson called an emergency meeting where usually quiet homesteaders spoke passionately about protecting their children's educational future, while Martha Anderson organized a letter-writing campaign to state officials, emphasizing the school's success and importance to rural families. The Hendersons revealed that Whitman had already approached them about selling their land, offering sums that were generous, but came with requirements that would force them to relocate far from the school. And Clara began to understand the systematic nature of the threat they faced. Winter deepened into January as Clara threw herself into research and planning with the desperate energy of someone fighting for survival, spending evenings by lamplight studying property laws, educational regulations, and anything else that might provide legal protection for their community. Alice and Samuel watched their mother work with worried eyes, sensing the tension, even if they didn't fully understand its source. And Clara struggled to maintain her teaching responsibilities. While grappling with challenges far beyond her experience or training, Pete proved surprisingly knowledgeable about legal matters, having fought similar battles during his mining days, and he guided Clara toward understanding that their best defense lay not in law but in making themselves too valuable to destroy. Breakthrough came when Clara received official word that Superintendent Williams had recommended her school for state recognition based on her innovative teaching methods and remarkable student outcomes, a designation that would provide both funding and legal protection against arbitrary closure. The letter arrived on the same day that Martha Anderson brought news of a journalist friend interested in writing about the miracle school in the ghost town, offering publicity that could bring both support and scrutiny. Clara stood holding the official recognition letter with hands that trembled slightly, realizing that she held in her grasp the key to their survival not just as individuals, but as a community that had chosen to bloom in unlikely soil. Pete watched her face transform with hope and determination, nodding with the satisfaction of someone who had recognized her strength long before she discovered it herself. February brought Charles Whitman back to Millfield with increased pressure and barely concealed threats. his patience with diplomatic persuasion clearly exhausted as he made pointed references to his investors' schedule and the inevitability of development with or without community cooperation. Clara met his renewed demands with quiet steel, informing him of the school's new state recognition and the growing political support for their educational experiment. But Whitman's response revealed the true extent of his resources and determination. Miss Harrison's state recognition is a piece of paper. Real power lies in ownership, and I've already secured options on most of the property in this area. Your school will close because the town itself will cease to exist. His words carried the weight of absolute certainty, and Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized they faced an enemy with resources far beyond their small community's ability to resist. The crisis deepened when Pete received an eviction notice, revealing that Whitman had somehow gained control of the property he'd occupied for decades through a complex arrangement of unpaid taxes and legal technicalities that left the old miner virtually helpless. Clara watched Pete read the official document with eyes that showed more hurt than anger, understanding that she was witnessing the destruction of a man who had weathered many storms but never expected betrayal through bureaucratic manipulation. The implications for her own situation became terrifyingly clear as she realized that Whitman's systematic approach would eventually reach every property in town, including the schoolhouse itself, and that legal recognition meant nothing without the physical space to house their educational community. That evening, as Clara tucked her children into bed, Samuel asked the question that had been haunting them all. "Mama, are we going to have to leave our school?" His innocent trust in her ability to fix any problem broke Clara's heart even as it strengthened her resolve, and she found herself making promises she wasn't sure she could keep about staying and fighting and protecting what they'd built together. Alice, older and more perceptive, took her mother's hand and whispered, "We won't let the mean man win, will we, Mama?" And Clara heard in her daughter's fierce loyalty the echo of her own determination to defend their unlikely family against forces that saw human achievement as merely obstacles to profit. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force, but Clara straightened under its burden and began to plan with the focused intensity of someone who had everything to lose. The transformation came not through dramatic confrontation but through quiet realization as Clara sat in the pre-dawn darkness of the schoolhouse, surrounded by the evidence of what they had accomplished: student artwork on the walls, carefully organized books, desks worn smooth by eager, young hands, and the lingering sense of belonging that had grown from shared purpose and mutual care. She understood suddenly that Whitman's greatest mistake lay in seeing only buildings and land values, where she saw something far more precious and powerful: a living community that could not be destroyed by legal documents or purchased with investor capital. The dawn light streaming through the windows illuminated not just a room but a vision of possibility that transcended physical space, and Clara felt the fear leaving her body as certainty took its place. They would not just survive this threat, they would transform it into opportunity for something greater than anyone had imagined. March brought a gathering storm as Whitman's pressure campaign intensified with legal notices, property surveys, and barely veiled threats that pushed the farming families toward a breaking point that would either destroy their community or forge it into something unbreakable. Clara called a meeting that filled the schoolhouse beyond capacity, with parents, children, and even neighboring families who had heard about their struggle, attending to witness what might be the final chapter of their educational experiment. The tension was palpable as Clara stood before the assembled crowd, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose: not retreat or compromise, but a bold expansion that would make their community too vital and visible to destroy without massive public outcry. "Friends, we've built something extraordinary here, but Charles Whitman sees only obstacles to his development plans," Clara began, her teacher's voice carrying clearly to the back of the crowded room. "However, what he fails to understand is that our strength lies not in the buildings we occupy, but in the bonds we've created and the vision we share. I propose we expand our mission, not just educating our own children, but creating a model agricultural community that demonstrates the possibilities of cooperative living and sustainable farming." The audacity of her proposal stunned the audience into silence, but Clara continued with growing conviction, outlining a plan that would transform Millfield from a dying town into a thriving educational and agricultural center that would attract positive attention from state officials, journalists, and progressive thinkers throughout the region. The response to Clara's vision surprised even her most optimistic hopes, as family after family stood to pledge support for the expanded community project, offering skills, resources, and unwavering commitment to the fight for their shared future. Jacob Anderson volunteered his carpentry expertise for building expansion, while Martha Anderson offered to coordinate communication with state agricultural officials who might provide support and resources. The Henderson family pledged their best livestock for breeding stock, and even the Shy Kowalskis stepped forward with carefully saved money and an offer to establish gardens that would demonstrate immigrant agricultural knowledge to the broader community. Pete, his eyes bright with something Clara had never seen there before, stood slowly and declared that he would deed his property to the community trust they were forming, ensuring that at least one piece of Millfield would remain forever beyond. Whitman's grasp that summer brought remarkable transformation as the expanded Millfield community attracted attention from unexpected quarters, including agricultural colleges, educational reformers, and even government officials interested in their innovative approach to rural development. Clara found herself corresponding with university professors who wanted to study their teaching methods, agricultural experts who praised their sustainable farming initiatives, and journalists who saw in their story a powerful example of American ingenuity and cooperation. The school grew to accommodate children from increasingly distant families who relocated specifically to join their educational community, while the agricultural projects produced both food for the growing population and income from sales to surrounding towns. Whitman's development pressure continued, but it now faced an organized, visible, and politically connected community that could not be dismissed or destroyed without significant consequences. The final confrontation came not through legal battles, but through public demonstration of value, as Millfield hosted its first annual agricultural and educational fair, drawing visitors from across the state to witness firsthand what Clara's vision had accomplished in less than 2 years. Charles Whitman arrived with investors and legal representatives, clearly intending to present their development plans to the gathered crowd, but found instead a celebration of human achievement that made their profit-focused proposals seem small and shabby by comparison. Children from the school presented research projects on sustainable farming, innovative teaching methods, and community cooperation, while the agricultural displays demonstrated productivity levels that impressed even skeptical businessmen. Clara watched Whitman's face as he realized that his systematic campaign to destroy their community had instead transformed it into something far stronger and more valuable than he had imagined possible. And she saw in his expression the recognition of complete and irreversible defeat. The aftermath of the fair brought official recognition from the state education department, funding from agricultural colleges interested in supporting their experimental programs, and most importantly, legal protection for their community, trusts that placed their land permanently beyond the reach of developers like Whitman. Clara stood in her expanded schoolhouse, now featuring additional classrooms, a library, and workshop spaces for practical education, watching her students work with the focused enthusiasm that had become Millfield's hallmark. The enrollment had grown to 43 children from families who had chosen to relocate specifically to join their educational community, while the agricultural projects generated enough income to support infrastructure improvements and teacher salaries for additional staff. Pete, now recognized as the community's elder statesman and official historian, spent his days teaching children traditional skills and telling stories that connected their present achievements to the town's mining heritage. Alice, now 12, and acknowledged as one of the school's most promising scholars, had blossomed into a confident young woman who served as translator for new immigrant families and assistant teacher for younger children. Her natural leadership abilities nurtured by the community's commitment to developing every child's potential. Samuel, at 7, had become the unofficial ambassador for visitors, his innocent enthusiasm and perfect English helping to demonstrate the school's success with children of all backgrounds and abilities. Clara watched her own children thrive in ways that would have been impossible in their previous life, understanding that her desperate gamble on a ghost town had provided them with something far more valuable than a sense of belonging and purpose that would guide them throughout their lives. The Christmas program of their second year drew visitors from 4 states, including education officials, agricultural experts, and representatives from universities, interested in establishing formal partnerships with Millfield's innovative community. Clara stood at the back of the packed church, now serving as their assembly hall, listening to her students perform with the confidence and joy that had become their trademark, and felt a deep satisfaction that transcended personal achievement. They had not simply survived Charles Whitman's assault on their community. They had transformed the challenge into an opportunity to demonstrate the power of cooperative effort and shared vision. The applause that filled the building carried the warmth of genuine appreciation for excellence achieved through collective effort. And Clara understood that they had created something that would endure long after the current generation of children had grown and moved into the wider world. On New Year's Day, Clara walked the streets of Millfield in the crisp morning air, marveling at the transformation from the ghost town she had first encountered 3 years earlier to the thriving community that now bustled with purposeful activity even on holidays. The main street featured a general store, a library, a workshop for practical education, and several boarding houses for families relocating to join their community, all maintained by cooperative effort and shared ownership. Children played in the streets with the easy confidence of young people who had never known anything but acceptance and encouragement, while adults gathered in small groups to discuss everything from crop rotation to curriculum development with the engaged enthusiasm of people invested in their shared future. Clara paused at the schoolhouse steps where she had first read Pastor Matthew's abandonment note, remembering the despair that had nearly overwhelmed her, and smiled at the recognition that some failures simply cleared the ground for greater success. The morning mail brought a letter from the state capitol offering Clara a position as Director of Rural Education Development, an opportunity to spread Millfield's innovations to struggling communities throughout the region. But she read the flattering proposal with detached interest rather than excitement. Her work here was far from finished, and the idea of leaving the community they had built together held no appeal compared to the daily satisfaction of watching children discover their potential and families thrive through cooperative effort. Alice read over her shoulder and grinned with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never doubted her mother's priorities, while Samuel announced importantly that he was going to be a teacher too when he grew up, just like Mama. But, for farming, Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, not as rejection but as validation of how far they had traveled from the desperate refugees who had arrived on the train platform with nothing but hope and $37. As evening settled over Millfield, Clara stood in her kitchen preparing dinner while Alice helped Samuel with arithmetic problems at the table they had built from lumber donated by the Henderson family, their voices mixing with the sounds of neighbors calling to each other across the yards and the distant laughter of older children skating on the pond behind the school. The ordinary domestic scene filled Clara with profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them from abandonment to belonging, from isolation to community, from desperation to the deep satisfaction of meaningful work shared with people who had become family by choice rather than chance. Through the window, she could see Pete splitting wood for the schoolhouse stove, his movements still strong despite his years, and she understood that their unlikely family had found in each other not just survival but the deeper human need for purpose and connection. The ghost town had been transformed not by magic but by the simple power of people who refused to accept defeat, who chose to plant seeds in unlikely soil and tend them with patience, faith, and unwavering commitment to the belief that education and community could flourish anywhere that human hearts were willing to nurture growth. Clara smiled as she called her children to dinner, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but confident that whatever the future held, they would face it together as a community that had learned to transform abandonment into abundance through the revolutionary act of refusing to give up on each other.